Captain Sarah Martinez had heard the whispered comments countless times as she walked through the corridors of Ramstein Air Base. Just logistics, they would say, as if moving mountains of equipment and coordinating global supply chains was somehow less important than flying jets or commanding troops. She had learned to ignore the dismissive tone, the way conversations would shift when she approached, the subtle exclusion from the informal networks that really mattered in military circles. Sarah's office was tucked away in Building 412, far from the glamorous flight lines where the real heroes worked, or so everyone seemed to believe. Her walls were covered with charts showing shipping routes, inventory levels, and delivery schedules that spanned continents. While pilots talked about their missions in terms of hours, Sarah thought in terms of months and years, planning the intricate ballet that kept aircraft flying, soldiers fed, and operations running smoothly across 3 time zones. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at 0530, 2 hours before most of the base stirred to life. She preferred these quiet moments when she could review overnight reports from suppliers in Germany, track shipments crossing the Atlantic, and coordinate with teams in Afghanistan who were 12 hours ahead. Her computer screen showed red alerts from 3 different locations, each representing a potential crisis that could ground aircraft or leave troops without essential supplies. The first crisis was in Kuwait. A critical engine component for the C-036 construct aircraft had been damaged during unloading. Without it, 6 aircraft would be grounded within 72 hours. Sarah immediately contacted her network of suppliers, cross-referencing part numbers with alternative sources. She found a compatible component in a warehouse in Texas, but getting it to Kuwait in time would require creative routing through 3 different cargo flights. While coordinating that emergency, her phone rang with another problem. A shipment of medical supplies bound for a forward operating base in Syria had been delayed at customs in Turkey. The base medic was reporting critically low stocks of antibiotics and surgical supplies. Sarah knew this wasn't just about paperwork. Lives could hang in the balance. She began making calls to her contacts in the Turkish customs office, people she had carefully cultivated relationships with over months of patient communication and small favors. As she worked both problems simultaneously, taking notes on multiple screens and coordinating with teams across the globe, Sarah noticed Colonel Davidson standing in her doorway. The base commander rarely ventured into the logistics wing, preferring to summon people to his office when needed. His presence here was unusual enough to make Sarah pause her phone conversation. "Captain Martinez, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that made junior officers straighten unconsciously. Sarah quickly wrapped up her call and gestured for him to take a seat, though the cramped office barely had room for 2 people. Colonel Davidson looked around at the organized chaos of Sarah's workspace. Charts, printouts, and multiple computer monitors created a command center that looked nothing like the sterile offices of traditional military leadership. "I've been hearing things," he began, his tone unreadable. "Some of the squadron commanders have been talking." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. In her experience, when squadron commanders talked about logistics, it usually meant something had gone wrong. She mentally reviewed the past week's operations, searching for any failures that might have reached the colonel's attention. "They're saying that every time they have a problem, every time something goes sideways with equipment or supplies, somehow it gets fixed," the colonel continued. "They're saying there's someone in logistics who makes miracles happen, but they don't even know her name. They just say call that woman in Building 412 and somehow things work out." Sarah remained silent, unsure whether this was leading to praise or criticism. In the military, being too good at your job could sometimes be as problematic as being bad at it, especially if you were working outside normal channels or bypassing established procedures. The colonel leaned forward. 3 weeks ago, when half the fighter squadron was grounded because of a faulty hydraulic system, somehow replacement parts appeared overnight. The squadron commander swears he was told it would take 2 weeks minimum to get those parts. "How did that happen, Captain?" Sarah remembered that incident clearly. The official channels would have taken 2 weeks, but she had remembered a conversation with a maintainer from another base who mentioned having surplus hydraulic components. A few phone calls, some creative paperwork, and a favor called in with a transport pilot had moved the parts across Europe in 18 hours. "I found an alternative source, sir," Sometimes the standard procurement process isn't the fastest option. And last month, when the humanitarian mission to Somalia was about to be canceled because we couldn't source enough water purification tablets in time, the colonel pressed. Suddenly, cases of tablets appeared on the tarmac. The mission commander said it was impossible, that those supplies didn't exist anywhere in theater, that one had required even more creativity. Sarah had contacted a civilian aid organization that had excess supplies, arranged for a cost-neutral swap of equipment, and coordinated delivery through a commercial cargo company that owed her a favor from a previous emergency. The paperwork had been complex, but everything was completely legal and properly documented after the fact. Colonel Davidson studied her for a long moment. "Captain, what you're doing isn't just impressive. It's changing how this base operates. You're making things possible that other people consider impossible. But you're doing it so quietly, so efficiently, that most people don't even know who you are. They think logistics is just about moving boxes and filing paperwork." Sarah finally spoke up. "Sir, logistics is about solving problems. Moving boxes and filing paperwork are just tools. The real job is making sure the mission succeeds, whatever that takes." The colonel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because I just received a call from Air Force Global Strike Command. They have a situation developing that's going to require someone with your particular talents. Someone who can make impossible things happen without anyone noticing how they did it." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Global Strike Command handled some of the most sensitive and critical operations in the Air Force. If they were calling for help, it meant something big was developing. "There's going to be a briefing tomorrow morning at 0800, the colonel continued. "But I wanted to give you a heads up because this assignment is going to be different from anything you've done before. We're not talking about routine supply issues or even emergency repairs. This is something that could affect national security." He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Captain. I think it's time people started knowing your name. The days of being just logistics are over. From now on, when people ask who solved their impossible problems, I want them to know it was Captain Sarah Martinez." After the colonel left, Sarah sat in her office trying to process what had just happened. For 3 years, she had worked in relative anonymity, taking pride in solving problems rather than taking credit for solutions. The idea of stepping out of the shadows was both thrilling and terrifying. She turned back to her computer screens, where the Kuwait engine problem and the Turkish customs issue were still waiting for resolution. These were the kinds of challenges she understood, with clear parameters and logical solutions. Tomorrow's briefing promised something entirely different, something that would test not just her logistical skills, but her ability to operate in the high-stakes world of strategic military operations. The afternoon flew by as Sarah worked her magic on the 2 crises. By 1700 hours, the engine component was on a cargo flight to Kuwait with guaranteed delivery in 36 hours. The medical supplies had cleared Turkish customs and were already en route to Syria. 2 potential disasters had been averted through careful planning, creative problem-solving, and the network of relationships Sarah had built over years of quiet competence. As she prepared to leave the office, Sarah's computer chimed with an encrypted message. The sender was listed only as AFGSC Operations, and the message was brief. "Captain Martinez, report to Building 500, Conference Room Alpha 0800 tomorrow. Classification, secret. Come prepared to discuss global supply chain vulnerabilities and mitigation strategies." Sarah printed the message and locked it in her secure filing cabinet. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine, but tonight she would do what she always did: prepare thoroughly, think creatively, and get ready to make the impossible possible. The woman they called Just Logistics was about to discover that the Air Force had been watching her work all along, and they had plans that would test every skill she had developed in her years of quiet excellence. Sarah arrived at Building 500 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio containing her laptop and a stack of printed reports she had compiled through the night. The building housed some of the most secure conference rooms on base, where classified briefings and strategic planning sessions took place behind reinforced doors and electronic countermeasure systems. Conference Room Alpha was larger than she had expected, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by high-backed chairs. 3 large screens dominated one wall, currently displaying the Air Force Global Strike Command seal. As Sarah took a seat near the middle of the table, she recognized several faces from around the base, though she had never worked directly with any of them. These were the people who made strategic decisions, planned major operations, and briefed generals. At precisely 0800, General Patricia Hawkins entered the room. Sarah had only seen the general from a distance during formal ceremonies, and her presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present. General Hawkins was known throughout the Air Force as a no-nonsense leader who had risen through the ranks during some of the most challenging operations of the past 2 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. General Hawkins began, activating the secure communication system with a card key. What we discuss in this room today is classified secret. Nothing leaves this room without explicit authorization. Captain Martinez, I understand you've been briefed on the classification requirements. Sarah nodded, though she still had no idea why she was here among these senior officers and strategic planners. Her usual security clearance covered logistics operations, but this felt like something far beyond her normal scope of responsibility. General Hawkins clicked a remote, and the screens changed to display a world map with highlighted shipping routes and marked locations across multiple continents. 3 days ago, we received intelligence indicating that a hostile nation is planning to disrupt global military supply chains through a coordinated attack on key transportation nodes. This isn't just about attacking our bases or aircraft. They're targeting the invisible network that keeps our forces operational worldwide. Sarah studied the map, recognizing many of the marked locations as critical supply hubs she worked with regularly. Ports in Germany and Italy, airports in Turkey and Japan, distribution centers across the United States. If someone wanted to cripple military operations without direct confrontation, attacking the supply chain would be devastatingly effective. The intelligence suggests they've identified 12 critical choke points, the general continued, highlighting specific locations on the map. If they succeed in disrupting even half of these locations simultaneously, we would face severe operational constraints within weeks. Aircraft would be grounded for lack of spare parts, troops would face equipment shortages, and humanitarian missions would become impossible. Colonel Davidson, who had arrived just after the general, gestured toward Sarah. Captain Martinez has demonstrated an exceptional ability to work around supply chain disruptions. Her track record shows consistent success in finding alternative solutions when standard channels fail. Sarah felt all eyes in the room turn to her. She cleared her throat and spoke carefully. General, if I may ask, what kind of disruptions are we anticipating? Natural disasters, cyber attacks, physical sabotage. All of the above, General Hawkins replied grimly. The intelligence indicates a sophisticated multi-layered approach. They plan to use cyber weapons to disrupt shipping databases and logistics software, coordinate with local criminal organizations to create physical blockages at ports and airports, and potentially conduct sabotage operations at key facilities. The scope of the threat was staggering. Sarah had dealt with individual supply chain problems before, but this would be like facing every crisis she had ever handled simultaneously, all orchestrated by an intelligent adversary specifically trying to break the system. Major Thompson, the base's intelligence officer, activated another screen showing a timeline. The attacks are planned to begin in 6 days, during the peak of our quarterly supply rotation. They've timed this to cause maximum disruption when we're most vulnerable. Sarah studied the timeline, mentally cataloging the supply movement scheduled for that period. 6 days from now, we'll have 3 major humanitarian missions launching, 2 squadron deployments to new theaters, and the quarterly resupply for forward operating bases. If the supply chain gets disrupted then, we won't just face operational problems. People could die. General Hawkins nodded approvingly. Exactly. Which is why we need someone who can build a shadow supply network. Something that can operate independently of the systems they're planning to attack. Someone who knows how to make things happen when the normal methods fail. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the request became clear. They weren't asking Sarah to solve a specific logistics problem. They were asking her to essentially rebuild the Air Force's global supply chain from scratch, in secret, in less than a week. General, building an alternative supply network of that scope would require resources I don't currently have access to, Sarah said carefully. I would need authorization to contact civilian suppliers, coordinate with allied nations, and potentially bypass normal procurement procedures. You'll have that authorization, General Hawkins replied without hesitation. You'll also have a budget that doesn't officially exist, and access to transportation assets that aren't on any public manifest. Colonel Davidson will be your official liaison, but operationally you'll report directly to me. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the kind of challenge she had always dreamed of, the chance to operate at the highest levels of military logistics, but it was also terrifying. If she failed, the consequences would go far beyond grounded aircraft or delayed supplies. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, whom Sarah recognized as the base's operations director, leaned forward. Captain, we've analyzed your previous work. The way you solved the Somalia water purification crisis showed us you understand how to work with civilian organizations. The hydraulic system emergency proved you can coordinate rapid movement of critical supplies. But this operation will require you to do both simultaneously, on a global scale, under active opposition. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. I'll need a team. I can't coordinate a global operation alone, and I'll need people I trust in different time zones. I'll also need secure communications that can't be monitored or disrupted. Already arranged, General Hawkins said, sliding a tablet across the table to Sarah. You'll have a team of 12 specialists, each with expertise in different aspects of global logistics. They're being briefed simultaneously at bases around the world. You'll also have access to military satellite communication networks and encrypted civilian internet connections. Sarah activated the tablet and saw a list of names and specialties. Transportation specialists in Germany and Japan, procurement experts in the United States and United Kingdom, customs and documentation specialists in multiple countries. Each person was someone she had worked with before, people who understood how to solve problems creatively and quietly. There's one more thing, General Hawkins said, her tone becoming more serious. This operation requires absolute secrecy. The hostile nation has demonstrated sophisticated intelligence capabilities. If they discover we're building a shadow network, they'll adapt their attack to target our alternatives as well. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, you're conducting routine logistics exercises. Sarah understood the implications. She would be working to protect global military operations while pretending to do normal everyday logistics work. Any mistake, any security breach could compromise not just the operation but the safety of military personnel worldwide. Major Thompson activated a final screen showing communication protocols. You'll receive intelligence updates twice daily through secure channels. We'll provide early warning if any of the planned attacks are moved up or modified. But remember, the adversary is also monitoring our communications. Everything must appear routine. As the briefing continued, Sarah learned about the resources at her disposal. Civilian cargo companies that had previously worked with the military and could be trusted with sensitive shipments. Allied nations that had agreed to provide alternative transportation routes through their territories. Even commercial shipping companies whose executives had security clearances and understood the importance of the mission. The complexity was overwhelming, but Sarah found herself energized rather than intimidated. This was logistics at its highest level. The kind of work that could determine the outcome of global conflicts. Instead of just solving problems after they occurred, she would be preventing disasters before they happened. When the briefing ended, General Hawkins approached Sarah privately. Captain, I want you to understand something. This assignment could make or break your career. Success will open doors you never imagined. Failure could result in consequences that affect national security. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Sarah looked at the general directly. Ma'am, I've been preparing for this my entire career, even though I didn't know it. Every impossible problem I've solved, every creative solution I've found, every relationship I've built has been training for this moment. I won't let you down. General Hawkins smiled for the first time during the briefing. I believe you won't. And Captain? After this operation, I guarantee no one will ever call you just logistics again. What you're about to accomplish will change how the Air Force thinks about supply chain operations forever. As Sarah left the conference room, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 6 days to build a shadow supply network. 6 days to outthink an adversary who had been planning this attack for months. 6 days to prove that the woman they had underestimated was capable of protecting global military operations. She walked back to Building 412 with purpose, knowing that her quiet office would soon become the nerve center of one of the most critical operations in recent Air Force history. Sarah's office had been transformed overnight into something resembling a high-tech command center. 4 additional computer monitors had been installed. Secure communication equipment hummed quietly in the corner, and a large wall-mounted display showed real-time tracking of supply movements across the globe. The transformation was subtle enough that casual observers would assume it was just upgraded equipment for routine logistics work. At 0400 hours on the second day, Sarah was deep in conversation with Hans Mueller, her transportation specialist in Germany. Through encrypted video conference, they were coordinating alternative routes for critical aircraft parts that normally moved through the port of Hamburg, one of the 12 targeted locations. The civilian freight company in Munich has agreed to handle the shipments, Hans reported, his accent thick despite his fluent English. They have security clearances from previous NATO contracts and understand the sensitivity. But Sarah, routing everything through Munich, will add 18 hours to delivery times. Sarah studied the shipping manifests on her screen, calculating the impact. 18 hours we can work with. What we can't work with is losing the entire shipment if Hamburg gets compromised. How many alternative routes have you identified? 3 primary, 2 backup, Hans replied. But if they hit both Hamburg and Rotterdam simultaneously, we'll be forced to use the Austrian route, which has much lower capacity. This was the challenge Sarah faced at every location. Building redundancy into the supply chain meant accepting delays and increased costs, but the alternative was complete system failure. She made notes on her master chart, a complex web of alternative routes that grew more intricate with each passing hour. Her secure phone rang with a call from Technical Sergeant Mike Chen in Tokyo. "Captain, we've got a problem developing. The intelligence update shows they might be targeting civilian shipping databases, not just military ones. If they corrupt the customs and tracking systems, even our alternative routes could be compromised." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had been planning to use civilian shipping companies precisely because they would be outside the direct military supply chain. If the adversary was sophisticated enough to target civilian infrastructure as well, her entire strategy needed revision. "Mike, how quickly could we implement paper-based tracking for critical shipments?" she asked, already knowing the answer would be complicated. Theoretically possible, but it would require coordinating with customs officials at every port and airport. We're talking about dozens of countries, hundreds of individual officials. Even if they all agreed, the delay and error rates would be enormous. Sarah ended the call and immediately contacted Colonel Davidson. This was beyond her authority to resolve alone. Within an hour, she was back in Conference Room Alpha, presenting the new intelligence to General Hawkins and the strategic team. "Ma'am, if they're targeting civilian infrastructure, we can't rely on normal shipping documentation," Sarah explained, pointing to the affected systems on the large display. "Every container, every aircraft part, every medical supply shipment depends on digital tracking systems. If those systems go down or become corrupted, we lose visibility of everything in transit." General Hawkins studied the implications. "Captain, in your assessment, is it still possible to maintain operational capability under these conditions?" Sarah had spent the previous 4 hours running scenarios and calculations. "Yes, ma'am, but it requires a complete paradigm shift. Instead of trying to work around their attacks, we need to build a system that can operate without the infrastructure they're targeting." She activated her laptop and projected her analysis onto the room's screens. "I propose we implement what I'm calling analog redundancy. For every critical shipment, we create paper documentation that travels with the cargo and digital records that exist on isolated systems they can't access. We pre-position critical supplies at intermediate locations so we're not dependent on just-in-time delivery. And we establish human networks that can coordinate movements without using any digital communications they might be monitoring." Major Thompson looked skeptical. "Captain, that sounds like going back to supply chain methods from the 1980s. The inefficiency would be enormous. The inefficiency of this system would be about 15%, Sarah replied, having already calculated the trade-offs. "The inefficiency of having no system at all when they execute their attacks would be 100%. We're not talking about permanent changes. This is a temporary network that can operate independently until we can secure the primary systems." General Hawkins leaned forward with interest. "How long would it take to implement this analog redundancy system?" Sarah had been hoping no one would ask that question, because the answer was daunting. 4 days, if everything goes perfectly. I would need authorization to pre-position supplies at locations that aren't normally storage facilities, coordinate with customs officials who would have to process paperwork manually, and brief transportation personnel on procedures they haven't used in decades. The room was quiet as everyone considered the scope of what Sarah was proposing. She was asking for permission to essentially recreate the global military supply chain using methods that predated modern computer systems. Lieutenant Colonel Kim broke the silence. "Captain, you're talking about coordinating with hundreds of people across multiple time zones, many of whom don't have security clearances for this operation. How do we maintain operational security?" Sarah had anticipated this concern. "We compartmentalize the information. Each person only knows about their specific piece of the operation. To them, it looks like routine efficiency upgrades and emergency preparedness exercises. The only people who know the full scope are the 12 team members who already have clearance." General Hawkins studied Sarah's proposal for several minutes before speaking. "Captain, what you're describing is ambitious to the point of being nearly impossible, but given the intelligence we're receiving about the sophistication of the planned attacks, it might be our only option. You have authorization to proceed." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had just received permission to attempt something that had never been done before in the modern military, with a timeline that would test every skill she had developed over her career. The next 72 hours became a blur of coordinated chaos. Sarah worked 18-hour days, coordinating with her team members around the world while maintaining the appearance of conducting routine logistics operations. Her team in Germany successfully convinced 3 civilian shipping companies to adopt enhanced documentation procedures for upcoming military contracts. Her specialist in Japan arranged for critical aircraft parts to be stored at commercial warehouses near major airports, officially labeled as inventory optimization initiatives. The most challenging aspect was coordinating with customs officials. Sarah spent hours on encrypted phone calls with contacts in Turkey, Italy, and the United Kingdom, explaining that upcoming military shipments would include paper documentation as a backup verification system. Most officials accepted the explanation without question, assuming it was just another bureaucratic requirement. But Sarah's network of relationships proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Turkish customs official she had cultivated during the Syrian medical supply crisis agreed to have his staff trained on manual processing procedures. A port authority manager in Italy who remembered Sarah's help during a previous emergency arranged for dedicated staff to handle paper-based cargo tracking. On the 3rd day, Sarah received an intelligence update that made her blood run cold. The adversary had moved up their timeline. Instead of 6 days, they now had less than 48 hours before the attacks would begin. Sarah immediately convened an emergency video conference with her entire team. 12 faces appeared on her screen, representing the specialists who would make or break this operation. "Team, we just lost 2 days," she announced without preamble. "The attacks begin in 36 hours. I need status updates on every critical component, and I need to know what we can realistically accomplish in the time remaining." Hans in Germany spoke first. "Munich operations are fully established. We can handle 70% of normal Hamburg volume immediately, 90% within 12 hours of activation." Mike in Tokyo followed. "Asia-Pacific routes are ready. We have analog tracking systems in place and pre-positioned supplies at 4 locations. Major concern is volume capacity if they hit multiple ports simultaneously." One by one, each team member reported their status. Some regions were better prepared than others, but the emerging picture was encouraging. They had created a shadow supply network that could maintain approximately 80% of normal operations, even if all 12 targeted locations were completely disabled. Sarah felt a moment of pride in what they had accomplished, but she knew the real test was yet to come. Building the network was one thing. Operating it under attack conditions, with potentially thousands of supply shipments to track and coordinate, would be entirely different. As the conference call ended, Sarah received a priority message from General Hawkins. "Captain Martinez, intelligence indicates attacks will begin at 0300 GMT tomorrow. Shadow network activation is authorized at your discretion. The success of this operation now rests in your hands." Good luck. Sarah looked around her transformed office, at the screen showing supply movements across the globe, at the secure communication equipment that connected her to a team of specialists who trusted her judgment. Tomorrow, they would discover whether the woman they had called just logistics was capable of protecting global military operations when everything they had taken for granted was under attack. She picked up her secure phone and began making calls. It was time to activate the shadow network and prove that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and the quiet competence of people who made impossible things happen. At 0300 GMT, Sarah was staring at her screens when the first attack began. A red alert flashed on her intelligence feed. Hamburg port computer systems compromised. All digital tracking disabled. Within minutes, similar alerts appeared for Rotterdam, Istanbul, and 3 other critical logistics hubs. The coordinated cyber attack was proceeding exactly as intelligence had predicted. But Sarah was ready. Shadow network activation immediate, she announced into her secure communication system. Around the world, her team members began implementing the alternative systems they had spent 4 days creating. Hans in Germany immediately contacted the Munich Freight Company, which began processing shipments using the paper-based tracking system. Mike in Tokyo activated pre-positioned supplies and rerouted incoming aircraft to alternative airports. Sarah's phone rang continuously as base commanders and logistics officers around the globe reported system failures and requested guidance. To them, this appeared to be a catastrophic breakdown of the entire military supply chain. They didn't know that Sarah had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Ramstein Base, this is Captain Martinez. She answered another call from a frantic squadron commander. Yes, sir, I'm aware that the Hamburg shipment tracking is down. Your engine parts are already rerouted through Munich and should arrive on schedule. I'll send you the new tracking numbers within the hour. The first 6 hours tested every aspect of Sarah's shadow network. As digital systems failed across Europe and Asia, her team seamlessly shifted operations to alternative routes and manual tracking methods. The pre-positioned supplies proved invaluable when several critical shipments were delayed due to port closures. But the adversary wasn't finished. At 1100 hours, Sarah received reports of physical sabotage at 2 major airports and what appeared to be coordinated dock worker strikes at 3 European ports. The attacks had moved beyond cyber warfare to direct physical disruption. Sarah immediately contacted her team leaders. They're escalating beyond digital attacks. Hans, what's your situation in Munich? Airport operations normal, but we're seeing unusual activity at the freight terminals, Hans reported. Security is investigating potential sabotage attempts. We may need to activate the Austrian route sooner than planned. Sarah pulled up her contingency charts. The Austrian route would handle 60% of the Munich volume, but it would require coordinating with officials she hadn't been able to brief in advance. She began making calls, using every favor and relationship she had built over years of quiet competence. The next challenge came from an unexpected source. Major Thompson called with urgent intelligence. Captain, they've identified our alternative routes. Intercepts indicate they know about Munich, the Tokyo civilian warehouses, and at least 3 other backup locations. They're planning targeted attacks on our shadow network. Sarah felt her heart race. This was the scenario she had most feared. Building alternative systems was only effective if the adversary didn't know about them. If they could target her shadow network specifically, the entire operation could collapse. But Sarah had prepared for this possibility too. Implement Protocol 7, she announced to her team during an emergency conference call. All secondary alternatives immediate activation. Protocol 7 was the backup to the backup. Routes and resources that even Sarah's team members only knew pieces of. While her primary shadow network had been designed for efficiency, Protocol 7 prioritized redundancy above all else. It would be slower and more expensive, but it could operate even if the adversary discovered and attacked her known alternatives. The implementation was chaotic. Sarah found herself coordinating supply movements through shipping companies in countries she had never worked with before, using contacts of contacts to arrange emergency transportation. A critical medical supply shipment was rerouted through 4 different carriers in 3 countries before reaching its destination. An engine repair that would normally take 8 hours of shipping time required 36 hours of complex coordination. But it worked. By 1800 hours, 13 hours after the attacks began, Sarah's network was operating at approximately 75% of normal capacity. Base commanders who had been panicking in the morning were reporting that critical supplies were arriving on schedule, even though they had no idea how the shipments were being tracked and coordinated. General Hawkins arrived at Sarah's office as the first day of the crisis was ending. The general looked around at the controlled chaos of multiple computer screens, secure phone lines, and the wall display showing supply movements across multiple continents. "Captain, I've been receiving reports all day," the general began. "Squadron commanders who expected to ground aircraft because of parts shortages are reporting normal operations. Medical officers who thought they would run out of critical supplies are receiving full shipments. Humanitarian missions that should have been canceled are proceeding on schedule. How is this possible when half our logistics infrastructure is compromised?" Sarah gestured to her screens, where green indicators showed successful deliveries and rerouted shipments. "Ma'am, we're operating a completely independent supply network. The adversary successfully attacked the systems everyone knows about, but they didn't know about the systems we built specifically for this scenario." General Hawkins studied the display with obvious amazement. "Captain, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary, but can you sustain this level of operations? Some of these alternative routes must be incredibly expensive and labor-intensive." Sarah had been calculating those costs throughout the day. "Yes, ma'am, it's expensive. We're spending approximately 40% more than normal operations, and we're requiring manual coordination that normally would be automated. But the alternative would be complete operational failure. We can maintain this system for 2 to 3 weeks while the primary infrastructure is restored. Over the next week, Sarah's shadow network proved its worth repeatedly. When the adversary attempted to disrupt shipping in the Mediterranean by coordinating with criminal organizations, Sarah's team had already rerouted critical supplies through alternative ports. When they targeted civilian freight companies with sophisticated cyber attacks, Sarah's paper-based tracking systems continued operating normally. The most impressive moment came on day 5, when intelligence indicated the adversary was planning to attack a humanitarian mission scheduled to deliver medical supplies to a refugee camp in Jordan. Sarah's network not only maintained the original mission timeline, but actually accelerated delivery by using pre-positioned supplies and civilian contractors who weren't on any military target list. Colonel Davidson visited Sarah's office as the crisis entered its second week. "Captain, I've been getting calls from commanders around the world. They're asking how logistics operations have actually improved during what should have been the worst supply chain crisis in decades." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Sir, when you're forced to examine every process and eliminate every inefficiency, you sometimes discover better ways of doing things. Some of these alternative methods might be worth keeping even after the primary systems are restored." The breakthrough came on day 8, when cybersecurity teams successfully identified and neutralized the malware that had been compromising military logistics systems. Port operations began returning to normal, and the immediate crisis phase ended. But the impact of Sarah's work was just beginning. 3 days after the crisis officially ended, Sarah received an unexpected summons. Not to Conference Room Alpha this time, but to the base commander's formal office. When she arrived, she found not just General Hawkins, but also 2 other generals she didn't recognize, and a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Captain Martinez," General Hawkins began formally, "I'd like you to meet General Rebecca Foster, Commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, General James Wright from the Pentagon's Logistics Directorate, and Dr. Susan Chen, Deputy Secretary of Defense for Supply Chain Security." Sarah felt suddenly aware that she was standing in front of some of the most senior leadership in the entire military establishment. She came to attention and waited for whatever was coming next. "Dr. Bacolta Lecter," Chen spoke first. "Captain, what you accomplished during the past week has been briefed to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You didn't just maintain military operations during a coordinated attack on our logistics infrastructure. You demonstrated capabilities that no one knew existed." General Foster continued. "The shadow network you created operated more efficiently in some areas than our standard systems. Your team coordinated global supply movements with greater flexibility and responsiveness than we've seen before. This wasn't just crisis management. This was innovation under pressure." Sarah remained silent, unsure what response was expected. General Wright opened a folder on the table. "Captain, we're offering you an assignment that has never existed before. We want you to head a new office. Global supply chain resilience. You would be responsible for building permanent alternative networks, training teams worldwide on adaptive logistics, and preparing the military for supply chain warfare. The scope of the offer was staggering. Sarah would be leaving behind her quiet office in Building 412 to take charge of strategic logistics at the highest levels of military planning. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen added with a slight smile. This assignment comes with an immediate promotion to major and a presidential commendation for exceptional service. The citation will read that you'd demonstrated extraordinary competence in protecting critical military operations under enemy attack through innovative logistics solutions and exceptional leadership. Sarah felt tears threaten to form in her eyes. After years of working in anonymity, of being dismissed as just logistics, she was being recognized at the highest levels of government for the skills she had always known were important.
"Ma'am, I accept the assignment," Sarah said quietly.
General Hawkins stood up and extended her hand. "Major Martinez, there's one last thing. From now on, when people ask about the officer who can make impossible things happen, who can solve any logistics problem no matter how complex, we want them to know your name, and we want them to know your call sign." Sarah looked puzzled. "Call sign, ma'am?" General Hawkins smiled. "Major, from this day forward, your call sign is Lifeline, because that's what you've proven to be for military operations around the world. You're not just logistics anymore. You're the lifeline that keeps everything connected, no matter what tries to break it." As Sarah walked out of the building wearing her new major's insignia, she thought about the journey from her cramped office where people whispered just logistics to this moment of recognition. The woman who had once been invisible to most of the military establishment was now being entrusted with protecting the systems that kept global operations running. Her phone buzzed with a message from Hans in Germany. "Congratulations, Major Lifeline. The team is ready for whatever impossible mission comes next." Sarah smiled and looked up at the aircraft taking off from the runway, knowing that somewhere in their cargo holds were supplies and equipment that would keep missions operating around the world. And now everyone would know that Major Sarah, Lifeline Martinez, was the one making sure they arrived exactly where and when they were needed, no matter what obstacles stood in the way. The woman they had called just logistics had become something the military had never had before, a strategic logistics warrior, capable of fighting and winning battles that most people never even knew were happening. And she was just getting started.